The smell is what I remember first. Not the sound of the rain hammering the farmhouse roof, not the way the windows rattled in their frames like they were trying to warn me. The smell, sweet and chemical and wrong, seeping up through the kitchen floor the night I decided to finally tear out the warped linoleum my grandfather had laid down 30 years ago. I'd been in the house for 6 days. 6 days since the highways stopped moving. 6 days since the emergency broadcast switched from instructions to static. 6 days since my neighbor, Paul Whitmore, a man I'd borrowed a socket wrench from exactly once, walked into his backyard at 4 in the morning and started eating his own dog. I watched it from my upstairs window. I didn't call anyone. There was no one left to call. My name is Elliot Voss. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in this house, left when I was 18, and came back 9 days ago because my mother had finally died, and someone had to deal with the estate. The timing was either the worst luck of my life or the only thing that saved it. The farmhouse sits on 11 acres outside Harlan, Iowa, and when the infection reached the coasts, I was already here, surrounded by soybean fields and silence. By the time it reached us, most people had already run. The ones who stayed either locked their doors or stopped being people. I wasn't tearing up the floor for renovation. I was looking for the source of a draft. The kitchen had gone cold on day 4 despite the furnace running full, and I could feel air moving near the island counter. Cool, steady air that didn't belong. I figured a pipe had cracked, maybe an old root cellar entrance my mother had covered over. I pulled the linoleum back in strips, and underneath I found the original pine planking my great-grandfather had milled. And cut into those planks, hidden beneath a seam of industrial adhesive, was a door. Not a root cellar hatch. A door. Steel reinforced, with a recessed handle and a rubber gasket seal that looked newer than anything else in the house. I knelt there for a long time, my knees on the cold wood, flashlight in my teeth, trying to understand what I was seeing. My mother had lived here alone for 11 years after my father died. She never mentioned this. Nobody mentioned this. I pulled the handle. The seal broke with a sound like a jar opening, a soft, pressurized exhale, and the smell hit me full in the face. Antiseptic, stale air, something human underneath it. I aimed the flashlight down into a shaft fitted with a steel ladder, bolted into concrete walls. The shaft dropped maybe 15 feet. At the bottom, I could see a floor, poured concrete, clean. My first thought was, my grandfather built this during the Cold War, some kind of fallout shelter. That made sense. He was that kind of man, practical, paranoid, quiet about both. But the gasket seal was modern. The bolts on the ladder were stainless steel, not rusted iron. Someone had maintained this. Recently. I should have closed the door, pushed the island back over it, pretended I never found it. But here's the thing about being alone in a dead world. Curiosity doesn't compete with fear the way it used to. It competes with the silence. And the silence was winning, anonym. I climbed down. The shaft opened into a corridor, maybe 4 feet wide, lined with the same poured concrete. LED strip lights were mounted along the ceiling, off but intact. I followed the corridor 8 paces to a second door, this one heavy steel with a wheel lock, like something from a naval vessel. It was ajar. Not open, not sealed. Ajar, maybe 2 inches, as if someone had left in a hurry or wanted to listen to what was happening above. I pushed it open and stepped into a room the size of my mother's entire ground floor. Shelving units lined 3 walls, stocked with canned goods, water containers, medical supplies. A cot in the far corner, blankets folded with military precision. A chemical toilet behind a curtain. A workbench with hand tools, a crank radio, and a notebook, open, face down. The air was cool, maybe 60 degrees, dry, and utterly still. Someone had been living here. Not years ago. Not during some forgotten emergency drill. The water in the kettle on the small propane burner was room temperature. A mug sat beside it, stained with coffee. A pair of boots stood next to the cot, laces tucked inside. Size 10, men's, worn at the heels. And on the workbench, next to the notebook, sat a small framed photograph of my mother. I picked it up. My hands were shaking. In the photo, she was younger, maybe 50, maybe 55, standing in the garden out back, smiling at whoever held the camera. I had never seen this picture before, and I realized, with a certainty that settled like ice water in my chest, whoever had been living in this bunker had not broken in. They had been invited. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the hatch open beside me. The flashlight pointed down the shaft like a sentry, and I read the notebook. The handwriting was small and controlled. Mail, I assumed. No name on the first page, just a date. September 14th, roughly 2 years earlier, and a single line. Arrived. House empty. E doesn't know. The E was me. Had to be. My mother's only child, the one who'd left and barely called, the one who sent money instead of visits. Elliot, the son who didn't know. The entries were sparse and practical. Inventory lists, temperature logs, notes on the filtration system. There was a filtration system. I hadn't even found it yet. And occasional references to MM, who I understood to be my mother. M brought canned pears, said the garden did well this year, told her the seal on the east wall needs replacing. She said she'd order the part. This was not a stranger hiding in a hole. This was a relationship, coordinated, maintained. I turned pages, scanning for anything that would explain who this person was, why my mother had kept this secret, and where they had gone. Midway through the notebook, the tone shifted. The dates jumped forward to roughly 6 weeks before my arrival. Radio reports inconsistent. M says the news is calling it containment. Containment of what? She won't say directly, but she watches the road now. She didn't used to watch the road. Then, 11 days before I drove into Harlan, M, not well, coughing, refused to go to the clinic. Said the clinic was closed. I asked if she wanted me to come up. She said not yet. The last entry was dated 2 days before my mother died. She didn't come down today. Went up after dark. Found her on the couch. She's gone. I closed her eyes. I don't know who to call. I don't know if anyone answers anymore. I put the notebook down. The kitchen was dark, except for the flashlight beam cutting into the shaft. And I sat there trying to feel something clean. Grief, anger, betrayal. But it was all tangled together. Knotted with the ugly guilt of a son who hadn't known his mother was dying because he hadn't bothered to ask. Someone had been with her. Someone had closed her eyes. And I didn't even know their name. The next morning, I searched the bunker properly. The filtration system was in a second, smaller room behind the main chamber. An air scrubber connected to a vent that exited somewhere in the north field, camouflaged by a drainage cap. The water supply tapped into the well line, with a manual pump as backup. There was a small battery bank, charged by a solar panel I later found hidden among the barn roof tiles. Whoever built this, or rebuilt it, had done so with serious engineering knowledge and serious patience. In a plastic bin under the cot, I found clothes. 2 sets, neatly folded, a shaving kit, a worn Bible with no name inscribed, and at the bottom, a faded military ID card. The name read, Dale Mercer, U.S. Army, D.O.B., November 3rd, 1951. I didn't recognize the name. I studied the photo. An older man, lean face, deep-set eyes, close-cropped gray hair. Nothing familiar. But the ID was expired by decades, and the man in the photo was young enough to be in his 40s. If he was still alive, Dale Mercer would be in his mid-70s now. I pocketed the ID and went upstairs. The rain had stopped. The fields were gray and still. And somewhere to the south, past the tree line, I could hear what I'd been hearing every night since day 3. The sound that wasn't wind, wasn't animals, wasn't anything that belonged to the world I grew up in. A low, arrhythmic moaning that rose and fell like breath through broken teeth. The infected didn't scream. That was the thing nobody prepared you for. They moaned, continuously, as if the virus had left just enough of their lungs working to express something their brains could no longer understand. I checked the perimeter. The fencing my grandfather had installed was chain link, 6 feet, not designed for defense, but enough to slow anything that couldn't climb. I'd reinforced the gate with wire and a padlock on day 2. The south fence showed no damage, but in the mud along the east side, near the old equipment shed, I found footprints. Fresh, boot prints, size 10. Dale Mercer hadn't left. He'd come back. I found him in the barn. He was sitting on an overturned feed bucket behind the tractor, eating peanut butter from a jar with a hunting knife. When I came through the door with the shotgun my father had kept above the bedroom closet, he looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as resigned. Not afraid, not hostile. Just the face of a man who had expected this moment and was tired of waiting for it. "You're Margaret's boy," he said. Not a question. "Elliot." I kept the shotgun level. "Who the hell are you?" "You found the bunker." Also not a question. He set the jar down on the concrete floor and folded the knife closed. His hands were steady. He was older than I'd expected. Late 70s maybe, but built like rope and leather. Weathered, not frail. His eyes were the color of creek water in November. "Dale Mercer," I said. "Army. Long time ago. You were living under my mother's house." I was living under my house. He said it quietly, without aggression, but the correction landed like a slap. "I built that shelter in 1987. Your grandfather gave me permission. I maintained it for 37 years. Your mother knew. Your father knew. You weren't told because you left and didn't come back. The silence between us filled with every holiday I'd skipped, every phone call I'd cut short, every year I'd let pile up between me and this place." He wasn't accusing me. He didn't have to. "Were you and my mother friends?" he said, and the word had a weight to it that told me it was both true and incomplete. "I was a friend to this family for a long time. When your father got sick, I helped with the property. When your mother got older, I helped with everything else. She let me keep the shelter stocked. I stayed down there when things started getting bad. She brought me food. I kept the systems running. She never said a word. She respected my privacy. I respected hers." He picked up the peanut butter jar again, then seemed to think better of it. "I left the bunker 2 days ago. Needed to check the vent cap in the north field. When I came back, the hatch was open, and I could hear someone walking upstairs. I didn't know if you were safe." "You've been sleeping in the barn for 2 days? I've slept in worse." I lowered the shotgun. Not because I trusted him, but because the arithmetic was simple. I was alone in a farmhouse with limited supplies and no practical survival skills beyond what I'd cobbled together from panic and internet memory. He was a man who'd built an underground shelter that had functioned for nearly 4 decades. Whatever he was more useful than my suspicion. "The infected," I said. "How many are out there?" "More every day." He stood, and I noticed the stiffness in his left knee, the careful way he balanced his weight. Old injury, old compensation. The first ones came through the south fields about 10 days ago, 3 of them. Walking, not running. I watched them from the vent cap. They passed the property line and kept going east toward the highway. They've been getting closer. I can hear them at night. Because they're clustering. Something about the grain elevators south of town. The metal, maybe, or the echo. They gather there after dark and spread out during the day. Right now, there might be 40, 50 in a 3-mile radius. In a week, it'll be more. "How do you know?" He looked at me with those creekwater eyes. "Because I've been watching this happen for 2 weeks, from a hole in the ground, son. I know the pattern. They follow noise, they follow movement, and they don't stop." We stood there in the barn, the gray light filtering through the slat walls, and I understood that my survival had just become a negotiation. Dale Mercer knew this land, knew this house, knew things about both that I'd never bothered to learn. But he was 70+ years old with a bad knee, living on peanut butter and stubbornness. We needed each other. Neither of us wanted to say it. "Come inside," I said. "We need to talk about what happens next." He nodded once, picked up a duffel bag I hadn't noticed behind the tractor, and followed me out of the barn. As we crossed the yard, I heard it again, that low, broken moaning from beyond the tree line, closer than last night. Dale heard it too. He didn't flinch. He just walked faster. Dale's knowledge of the property was encyclopedic and uncomfortable. He knew about the dry well behind the equipment shed that my grandfather had capped in 1979. He knew the barn's original foundation extended 6 feet beyond the current walls, creating a hidden crawl space accessible from the south side. He knew the farmhouse had been built with a double wall construction on the north face, an insulation technique from the 1930s that created a hollow cavity wide enough to store supplies or, in theory, hide a person. He told me these things over the kitchen table while we ate canned soup heated on the propane burner he'd brought up from the bunker. I listened and tried not to think about how much of my own family's history had been kept from me. Not maliciously, just completely. "Your grandfather was a careful man," Dale said, which I already knew. He planned for things most people didn't want to think about. The shelter was his idea originally, just a root cellar with pretensions. I expanded it after he died. Concrete walls, sealed ventilation, independent water. Your mother helped finance the last round of upgrades in 2019. 2019. While I was living in Chicago sending her birthday cards. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he pulled a folded paper from his duffel bag and spread it on the table. A hand-drawn map of the property, precise and detailed, with annotations in the same controlled handwriting I'd seen in the notebook. Every structure, every fence line, every water source, every potential entry point. He'd marked the south tree line in red. "This is our primary exposure," he said, tapping the red line. "The tree line gives them cover until they're within 200 yards of the house. If they come at night, we won't see them until they hit the fence. The fence won't hold. Not against numbers. 1 or 2, they'll press against it, maybe get tangled. 5 or more, they'll push through the chain link like paper. He traced a line from the barn to the house. I've been thinking about a secondary barrier. The equipment shed has corrugated steel panels we can repurpose. If we anchor them to the existing fence posts with lag bolts, we can create a reinforced perimeter around the house and the well access. That's a lot of work. That's survival. I studied the map. The property was roughly rectangular, the house centered, the barn to the northwest, the equipment shed to the east, the bunker entrance, marked with a simple X, directly beneath the kitchen. The north field stretched flat to the county road. The south and east were bordered by tree lines. The west was open soybean field, harvested months ago, now just frozen stubble. What about the bunker? I asked. If things get bad, we fall back underground? That's the last option, not the first. The bunker has air for 48 hours with 2 people and the scrubber running. After that, we're breathing our own carbon dioxide. It's a panic room, not a home. We stay topside as long as possible, and we make topside defensible. Over the next 2 days, Dale and I worked. Or rather, Dale directed and I labored, because the man's mind was sharp, but his body was honest about its age. We stripped the equipment shed of every usable panel and hauled them to the fence line. I dug post holes while Dale measured and cut. We reinforced the south and east perimeters first, the most exposed approaches, and created a double gate system at the main entrance using the tractor's detached plow blade as an inner barrier. The work was brutal and clarifying. My hands blistered, then bled, then started to callous. Dale showed me how to use the post driver, how to read the soil for depth, how to anchor steel to wood using techniques he'd learned in the Army and refined over decades of rural maintenance. We talked while we worked, not about the infection, not about my mother, but about the house, its bones, its history, the language of building things meant to last. On the second evening, while I was wiring the last panel to the east fence, I saw movement in the tree line. 2 figures, maybe 3, standing motionless at the edge of the shadows. They weren't walking. They weren't moaning. They were just standing there, facing the house, as if they were watching us. "Dale," I said. He was behind me, sorting bolts on the workbench we'd set up near the barn. He came over slowly, squinting into the fading light. When he saw them, his face did something I hadn't seen before. A micro-expression, there and gone, that might have been recognition. "They're observing," he said. "They don't observe, they walk and they bite. These are doing something different." He put his hand on my arm, a gesture that felt paternal and strange. "Don't move, don't make noise, just watch." We watched. The figures stood for maybe 4 minutes. Then, one by one, they turned and disappeared back into the trees. No moaning, no charge, just a silent retreat, as if they'd gathered the information they needed. "That's new," Dale said quietly. I didn't ask him what he meant. I could see it in his posture, the way his weight shifted, the way his jaw tightened. Whatever he'd been preparing for, whatever pattern he thought he understood, had just changed. That night, I lay awake in my mother's bedroom and listened to the silence where the moaning should have been. The absence was worse. Sound meant distance, direction, something to measure against. Silence meant they could be anywhere. Silence meant they were learning. The woman arrived on the 7th morning. I was on the roof. Dale had shown me how to access it through the attic hatch. Scanning the north field with a pair of binoculars that had belonged to my father, when I saw a figure on the county road. Moving fast, uneven, human in a way the infected were not. The infected had a uniformity to their movement, a mechanical persistence that erased individuality. This person was stumbling, correcting, running, limping, alive. I called down to Dale. He came out the kitchen door with the hunting rifle he'd retrieved from the bunker. A bolt-action .308 that he handled with the familiarity of a man who'd carried weapons professionally. One person, I told him. Coming from the north, maybe half a mile. Armed. Can't tell. They're carrying something. A bag, maybe. Watch the tree lines. If she's being followed, we'll see them break cover. She. He'd said she. I looked again. He was right. The figure's proportions, the way the hair caught the wind, the gait. A woman, running toward us on a road that led nowhere else. She reached the gate in under 10 minutes. By then I was on the ground, standing behind the reinforced fence with a shotgun. And Dale was positioned at the corner of the house with the rifle. The woman collapsed against the outer gate, gripping the chain link with both hands, and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts desperation and fury. Let me in. Her voice was hoarse, cracked. She was maybe late 20s, dark hair matted with sweat and something darker, wearing a canvas jacket over hospital scrubs. The bag she carried was a medical field kit, the kind paramedics use. Please, they're behind me, maybe 10 minutes. How many? I don't know, 8, 12. They've been following me since Defiance. Defiance was a town 15 miles north. 15 miles on foot with infected behind her. Dale, I called. I heard. His voice was calm. Check her. I looked at the woman through the fence. Are you bitten? Scratched? Any contact? No. She held up her hands, turned them over, pulled back her sleeves, tilted her neck. The gestures were practiced, like she'd done this before, at other gates, with other strangers. I'm clean. I'm a paramedic. Was a paramedic. Nora Castillo. I was working the field hospital in Woodbine when it fell. That was 5 days ago. I've been walking since. 5 days, alone, through territory that was getting worse by the hour. I looked at Dale. He was watching the north road through the rifle scope, his expression unreadable. Then he lowered the rifle and nodded once. I opened the gate. Nora came through like water through a crack, fast, fluid, already scanning the property as she entered. She clocked the reinforced fence, the double gate, the barn, the house. Her eyes were clinical, evaluative, the eyes of someone trained to triage situations as quickly as people. You've been fortifying, she said. Not a compliment, an assessment. We're trying. I closed and wired the gate behind her. The steel panels won't hold against a group. They'll bend at the anchor points. She dropped her field kit on the ground and pressed both hands against her lower back, stretching. You need cross-bracing, and something at the base. Buried cinder blocks, railroad ties, anything to prevent them from pushing underneath. Dale had come down from his position and was standing 10 feet away, studying her. You know construction? I know structural failure. I watched a hospital barricade collapse in under 3 minutes. She looked at him directly. You're military. Was. Good. Then you know that a perimeter is only as strong as its weakest discipline. Who else is here? Just us, I said. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Then we have a problem. 2 people can't maintain watch and work simultaneously. 3 is barely enough. She looked south, toward the tree line. How active is that approach? Getting more active, Dale said. And they're behaving differently, observing before approaching. Nora's expression shifted. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that suggested she was sorting through information she didn't want to share. I saw that in Woodbine. The newer ones, the ones infected in the last 2 weeks, they're not like the early cases. They're slower to engage, more deliberate. The doctors at the field hospital called it second phase behavior. We didn't have time to study it before the fences came down. Second phase. The words hung in the air like smoke. What does that mean? I asked. It means they're adapting, she said. And we need to work faster than they do. Nora changed the calculus of everything. Within hours of her arrival, the farmhouse shifted from a hiding place to something closer to an operation. She inventoried the medical supplies in the bunker and declared them adequate but incomplete. Antibiotics, but no antivirals. Surgical tools, but no anesthetic beyond lidocaine. Plenty of bandages, but almost no blood clotting agents. She organized everything into 3 tiers: daily access, trauma response, and what she called departure kit. The supplies we'd grab if we had to abandon the property in under 2 minutes. You plan for retreat before you plan for defense, she told me while sorting pill bottles on the kitchen counter. Every position is temporary. The moment you think a place is permanent, you stop looking for the exit. Dale thinks we can hold this property. Dale is 76 years old with osteoarthritis in his left knee and what I suspect is an undiagnosed cardiac arrhythmia based on the way he pauses on the stairs. Dale is brilliant, and Dale is going to die first if we don't manage his exertion. She said it without cruelty, but without softening. Medical fact delivered at medical speed. Dale, for his part, treated Nora with a cautious respect that I realized was generational. He was a man who'd grown up deferring to competence regardless of age or gender. But only once competence was proven. She proved it fast. On her second day, she identified a drainage issue along the south fence that was undermining the post foundations and designed a redirect using PVC pipe from the barn. Dale watched her work, nodded once, and never questioned her structural judgment again. The 3 of us settled into a rhythm. Dale handled strategy and watch scheduling. Nora managed medical readiness and structural integrity. I did the physical labor, hauling, digging, reinforcing, and maintained the solar-powered battery bank that kept the bunker's air scrubber and our limited lighting functional. We ate together twice a day, at the kitchen table, portioning canned goods with a precision that felt like ritual. But beneath the routine, pressure was building. The infected in the tree line were no longer occasional visitors. By Nora's 3rd night, I counted 11 figures standing at the south edge, motionless, facing the house. The next morning, the ground near the fence showed evidence of contact, handprints in the mud, places where something had leaned against the chain link and corrugated steel. They came at night, examined our defenses, and withdrew before dawn. They're testing the perimeter, Dale said at breakfast, stirring powdered coffee with a fork because we'd lost the only spoon somewhere in the yard. Systematically, a different section each night. That's not possible, I said. They don't strategize. Nora set down her mug. The ones in Woodbine did something similar before the hospital fell. They circled the building for 3 nights. On the 4th night, they hit the loading dock, the only entrance that hadn't been reinforced because it was on the 2nd floor, accessible only by a ramp we thought we'd destroyed. She paused. They rebuilt the ramp. Not well, not like engineers, but enough. Stacking debris, cars, dumpsters. It took them most of the night. By morning, they were inside. The silence that followed was the kind that reorganizes your understanding of what you're facing. I'd been operating on the assumption that the infected were a force of nature. Mindless, relentless, dangerous like a flood or a fire. What Nora was describing was something else. something that rendered every barricade, every fence, every reinforced wall into a temporary delay rather than a solution. "How long do we have?" I asked. Dale and Nora exchanged a look. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, an entire conversation happened. One built on experience and medical knowledge, and the pragmatism of people who had already watched safe places fall. "Days," Nora said. "Maybe a week if the group stays small. But groups don't stay small. They attract others. It's acoustic or chemical, we don't know. But a cluster of 12 becomes 20 becomes 50. We saw it happen in Woodbine in under 72 hours. Then we need to leave." "We need to be ready to leave," Dale corrected. "There's a difference. We stay as long as the perimeter holds, and we leave the moment it doesn't. That means the truck stays loaded, the bunker stays sealed as a fallback, and nobody sleeps without a bag packed." We spent the rest of that day preparing for departure without actually departing. Dale's truck, a 2004 Ford F250 he'd kept in the barn under a tarp, had a full tank and a toolbox welded to the bed. We loaded it with water, food for 10 days, the medical field kit, ammunition, blankets, and the hand-crank radio. Nora added her departure kit and insisted on mounting a sheet of plywood across the truck bed as a rudimentary shelter. I stood in the yard as the sun went down, watching the tree line, and tried to accept a truth I'd been avoiding. I was going to lose this house, my mother's house, the place where I'd learned to walk, where I'd hidden from thunderstorms, where I'd last heard my father's voice. The place I'd abandoned and returned to only after it was too late to matter. I was going to lose it the same way I'd lost everything else, by not paying attention until the cost was already final. The first breach happened 2 nights later, and it didn't come from the south. I was on the roof at 3 a.m., wrapped in a sleeping bag with the binoculars around my neck and the shotgun across my lap, when I heard a sound from the west side of the property, the open soybean field that we considered our safest flank. Not moaning, a rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across frozen ground. I turned the binoculars west and saw them. Not at the fence line. Beyond it, 50 yards into the field, moving in a loose formation that made my stomach drop. There were maybe 20 of them, spread in a rough arc, and they were dragging something between them. In the pale moonlight, it took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. They'd torn a section of metal roofing from some distant structure, a barn, a shed, something, and were carrying it horizontally, like a battering ram laid flat. "Dale." I was already moving toward the hatch. "Dale, west side, now." He met me at the bottom of the attic ladder, already dressed, rifle in hand. The man slept like a combat veteran, which I supposed he was. Fully clothed, boots loosely laced, weapon within arm's reach. "They're using a panel," I said. "A metal panel. They're going to bridge the fence or ram it." Dale's face went still, not shocked, calibrating. "Wake Nora. Get the truck started. Do it quiet." I found Nora in the downstairs bedroom she'd claimed, already sitting up, her field kit on the bed beside her. She'd heard my footsteps, had already begun preparing. "Breach?" "West side, 20 or more. They're carrying something." She grabbed the kit and moved to the kitchen. Through the window above the sink, we could see the west fence in the moonlight. The formation had reached the perimeter. They weren't ramming. They were leaning the metal panel against the fence, creating a ramp. The ones behind began climbing over. "They're bridging the fence," Nora said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the machinery of her training engaging. The paramedics practiced calm. The voice she'd used to talk to people while their bones were being set. We have maybe 5 minutes before they reach the house. Truck, Dale said from behind us. He'd come in through the front door, moving fast for a man his age. Now, don't run. Don't make noise you don't have to. Elliot, grab the notebook from the bunker. Nora, engine. I'll cover from the porch. The notebook? I stared at him. It has the coordinates. Go. I didn't argue. I dropped through the hatch, hit the ladder too fast, felt my ankle twist on the concrete floor, and limped to the workbench. The notebook was where I'd left it. I grabbed it, shoved it into my jacket, and climbed back up. The whole descent and return took maybe 90 seconds. When I came up through the hatch, I could hear them at the walls, not pounding, pressing. The west wall of the kitchen groaned, a structural sound, deep and wrong, as bodies pushed against it. Through the window I could see hands, gray and swollen, flattened against the glass. They weren't trying to break through. They were testing. I ran through the house to the front door. Nora had the truck running in the barn, headlights off. Dale was on the porch, rifle raised, watching 3 figures that had come around the north corner of the house. They stood 30 feet away, motionless, watching him the way the ones in the tree line had watched us days before. Walk to the barn, Dale said without turning. Slow, don't look at them directly. Dale. They respond to attention. I've been watching. Direct focus triggers engagement. Peripheral awareness doesn't. Walk now. I walked. Every nerve in my body was screaming to run. But I walked, keeping my eyes on the barn door, using my peripheral vision to track the 3 figures. They shifted. A slight rotation, heads turning to follow my movement. But they didn't advance. I reached the barn. Nora had the truck in gear, her hands white on the steering wheel. I climbed into the bed and banged on the cab roof twice. Dale backed off the porch, rifle still raised, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had retreated under fire before. When he reached the barn, he climbed into the passenger seat with a grunt of pain. His knee, always his knee. And Nora drove. She took the north road, headlights still off, navigating by moonlight, and the center line she could barely see. Behind us, I watched the farmhouse through the plywood shelter's gap. The figures didn't follow. They converged on the house instead, pressing against it from all sides, as if the structure itself was what they wanted. I watched until the road curved and the house disappeared behind the soybean field's frozen stubble, and I thought, they weren't trying to get to us. They were claiming the territory. We drove 4 miles in silence before Nora turned on the headlights. The road ahead was empty. The fields on either side were flat and still. Somewhere behind us, my mother's house was being absorbed by something that used to be human. And I was holding a dead man's notebook like it was a compass. "Where are we going?" Nora asked. Dale opened the notebook to a page I hadn't reached. Coordinates, handwritten, and below them a single word. Garretson. "South Dakota," he said. "There's a place. Built like the bunker but bigger. Designed for this." Designed for what? The end of the world? He didn't answer. He just pointed north, and Nora drove. We drove through the rest of the night and into a gray, textureless morning. The county roads were mostly clear, the advantage of rural Iowa, where the population was sparse enough that even an apocalypse left room to maneuver. We passed abandoned farmhouses, a gas station with its windows shattered and pumps dark, a school bus sitting diagonally across an intersection with its emergency door hanging open. No bodies, no infected visible, just the aftermath of departure, the landscape of people who had already gone. Dale navigated from the notebook, directing Nora through a series of back roads that avoided every town. He knew the routes the way he knew the farmhouse, intimately, from decades of quiet preparation. When I asked how long he'd been planning for this, he said, "Since 1983, and offered nothing else." Nora drove with a paramedic's focus, alert, responsive, emotionally offline. I'd begun to notice her pattern. In crisis, she became mechanical, precise, almost cold. Between crises, the warmth surfaced. Small gestures, a hand on Dale's shoulder when he struggled out of the truck, a quiet, "You okay?" directed at me after a rough stretch of road. She toggled between these modes like someone flipping a switch. And I understood it was how she'd survived Woodbine and the 5 days after. We stopped at midday in a farm equipment lot outside a town called Schaller. The lot was fenced, the gate unlocked, the office building empty. Dale needed to rest. His breathing had gone shallow and rapid during the last hour, and Nora had noticed before he admitted it. She checked his pulse, listened to his chest with a stethoscope from her kit, and told him to sit in the truck cab with his feet up. "Atrial fibrillation," she told me quietly while Dale's eyes were closed. "Irregular heartbeat, intermittent, probably been going on for years. Manageable with medication. Without medication, manageable with rest. But he can't sustain this level of stress without consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "Stroke, heart failure, sudden cardiac arrest." She said it the way she said everything medical, directly, without padding. "He needs beta blockers. We might find some at a pharmacy, but every pharmacy between here and South Dakota has probably been looted." "You're saying he might not make it?" "I'm saying we need to plan as if he might not." She held my gaze, and in her eyes I saw the thing she carried. The weight of triage, the math of deciding who gets the resources and who doesn't. She'd been doing that calculus since Woodbine, probably before. "He knows, Elliot. He's known longer than we have." I went back to the truck and sat on the tailgate, eating canned peaches while Dale slept. The equipment lot was quiet, surrounded by dormant fields, and for a few minutes the world felt almost normal. Just a man eating fruit in a parking lot on a cold day. Then I heard it, the moaning, distant but unmistakable, coming from the direction of Schaller. The town was maybe 2 miles east. Whatever was there was growing. We left within the hour. Dale woke up on his own, climbed out of the cab, and studied the map he'd drawn in the notebook. A wider version of the property map, showing routes across northwestern Iowa and into South Dakota. His hand was steady, but I noticed his color was off. Grayish. Nora noticed too. She said nothing. She just started the truck. The afternoon brought our first encounter on the road. We were on a gravel stretch between 2 unnamed fields when we came around a curve and found a pickup truck blocking both lanes. Doors open, engine still ticking with residual heat. It had been abandoned recently. In the ditch on the south side, a man was lying face down. Alive. We could see his back rising and falling. Next to him, kneeling, was a figure that looked human from behind, but moved with the characteristic stiffness of infection. Nora stopped the truck 50 yards back. Dale raised the rifle. I gripped the shotgun. The figure turned. Female, maybe 30, still wearing a name tag from a gas station chain. Her face was intact. Early stage, probably infected within the last few days. Her eyes tracked our truck with a focus that the older infected lacked. Second phase. Nora's term came back to me like a diagnosis. The man in the ditch moved, lifted his head, looked at us. "Help," he said. The word was a rasp, almost inaudible. "Please help." The infected woman didn't react to his voice. She reacted to ours. When Dale said, "Hold position," she oriented toward the truck, took 2 steps forward, then stopped, watching. "We can't reach him without passing her," Nora said. "We can shoot her," I said, "and alert everything within a mile." Dale lowered the rifle. "The sound carries. We fire 1 shot, and we'll have every infected between here and Schaller converging on this road." The man in the ditch was crying now. I could hear it, the soft, broken sound of someone who understands they've been abandoned by the world's logic. That help is 50 yards away, and it isn't coming. "Drive," Dale said. "Dale?" "Drive, Nora." She drove. Around the pickup, through the ditch on the north side, tires grinding through frozen mud. I watched from the truck bed as the man lifted his hand toward us, and the infected woman turned to watch him do it. We were past them in seconds. I didn't look back again because looking back would mean remembering his face, and I already had too many faces I couldn't forget. No one spoke for an hour. When Dale finally broke the silence, he said, "That's the cost. Nothing else, just that, the cost." As if survival was a currency and we'd just made a payment. We crossed into South Dakota on the 2nd day, using a farm bridge over the Big Sioux River that Dale directed us to with the precision of someone who had driven this route in his mind 1,000 times. The bridge was narrow, wooden, and groaned under the truck's weight, but it held. On the other side, the landscape opened up, flatter, wider, more exposed. I felt the absence of cover like a physical vulnerability, a thinning of the air between us and whatever was out there. Dale's condition had worsened. He was conscious, alert, still navigating, but his breathing came in shallow pulls, and he kept his left hand pressed against his chest in a way that Nora tracked with her eyes every few minutes. She'd found aspirin in the field kit, not a treatment, but a temporizing measure, and he'd taken it without comment. The unspoken understanding between the 3 of us was hardening into something permanent. Dale was guiding us somewhere he might not reach. Garrettson was a small town south of Sioux Falls, and Dale directed us not to the town itself, but past it, onto a private road that cut through a stand of bare cottonwoods to a property I wouldn't have looked at twice. A single-story ranch house, unremarkable, with a detached garage and what appeared to be a defunct grain operation. Silos, a corrugated equipment barn, a concrete pad. The kind of place that dotted the Great Plains by the thousands, invisible in its ordinariness. "Park behind the garage," Dale said, "out of sight from the road." Nora pulled around the garage and killed the engine. The silence was immense. No moaning, no wind, no sound at all except the ticking of the truck cooling. Dale got out slowly. Nora moved to help him, but he waved her off with a gesture that was gentle and absolute. He walked to the equipment barn, reached behind a steel support beam, and pulled a key from a magnetic box. The barn's main door had a deadbolt and a padlock. He opened both. Inside, past the expected clutter of a working farm, tools, pallets, a disassembled combine header, was a concrete staircase leading down. Not a ladder this time. Stairs wide enough for 2 people, with handrails and motion-activated LED strips that flickered on as we descended. The air changed immediately. Cool, filtered, pressurized. We went down 2 flights, maybe 25 feet, and emerged into a space that made the bunker under my mother's house look like a camping tent. It was a complex. There's no other word for it. A central corridor, maybe 60 feet long, with rooms branching off on both sides, living quarters with actual beds, 4 rooms, 2 bunks each, a kitchen with a propane stove, running water from an underground reservoir, and cabinets stocked with enough food for months. A medical room with a hospital-grade examination table, cabinets of pharmaceuticals and equipment Nora identified immediately, a portable defibrillator, an oxygen concentrator, IV supplies, a communications room with shortwave radios, a bank of car batteries, and a hand-crank generator. "Dale," I said, "what is this?" He was leaning against the corridor wall, breathing carefully. "A project. Started in 1991. 12 of us. Veterans mostly. Engineers, a doctor. We pooled money, bought the property through a trust, and built down instead of up. Took 15 years. 12 of you. Where are the others?" He was quiet for a moment. Martin died in 2008. Cancer. Houghton and Briggs in 2015. Car accident same night. Lewis had a stroke in 2020. Kimura moved to Japan, and we lost contact. The rest, he paused. The rest I don't know. We had a protocol. If the event happened, whatever the event was, we'd converge here. I've been monitoring the shortwave since the infection started. No one's responded. Nora was already in the medical room, opening cabinets with the controlled urgency of someone finding water in a desert. "Beta blockers," she called out. "Metoprolol, 50 milligram. Dale, get in here." He went. I stood in the corridor of a dead man's dream. A shelter built by 12 men who'd spent their lives preparing for a catastrophe only one of them had survived long enough to witness. And I felt the peculiar grief of inheriting something you didn't earn. Dale had given his life to this. Literally. Years of labor, decades of maintenance, the quiet sacrifice of a man who'd lived under a farmhouse so he could keep the systems running for a day he hoped would never come. I walked the complex slowly, opening doors, cataloging. A storage room with shelving floor to ceiling, ammunition, tools, spare parts, seeds in vacuum-sealed bags. A small library, survival manuals, engineering references, medical texts, and, unexpectedly, novels. Westerns mostly. A washroom with a gravity-fed shower. Everything functional, everything maintained, everything waiting. In the communications room, I sat down at the shortwave and turned the dial. Static across every frequency. I cycled through the bands Dale had marked in the notebook. Specific frequencies, scheduled times, call signs for people who were probably dead. Nothing. Just the hiss of an empty electromagnetic spectrum, the sound of a world that had stopped talking to itself. Then, on the lowest marked frequency, barely audible beneath the static, a voice. Fragmented, looping, automated. A recording, not a person. Garretson relay. Active. If you receive this, channel 7. 2200 hours. Garretson relay active. Someone had set this up. One of Dale's 12, or someone who'd found this frequency and piggybacked onto the protocol. The recording was clean, recent, running on a timer. Someone was alive, broadcasting, and waiting for an answer. I checked my watch. It was 4 p.m. 6 hours until 2200. Dale's first night in the Garretson complex was also his collapse. Nora had administered the metoprolol and put him to bed in the first living quarters room. And by midnight, his heartbeat had stabilized enough that she felt comfortable leaving him monitored but unattended. She rigged a crude alarm, a small bell taped to his wrist, connected by thread to the door handle, and joined me in the communications room at 21:45. "If he exerts himself again at the level of the last 3 days, his heart will give out," she said, sitting in the metal folding chair across from the radio bank. "The medication buys time. It doesn't fix the underlying damage." How much time? Weeks, months, if he truly rests. She looked at me steadily. He won't truly rest. You know that. I did. Dale Mercer had spent his entire adult life in motion toward this moment, building, maintaining, preparing. Asking him to stop now would be like asking a river to pause. The current was the man. At 2200 exactly, I keyed the shortwave to channel 7 and spoke into the microphone, using the call sign Dale had written in the notebook. Garretson Relay, this is Vanguard 6, responding to broadcast. Over. Static. 30 seconds. A minute. I repeated the call. More static. Then, Vanguard 6, this is Relay. Confirm occupancy. How many? A woman's voice. Older, calm, with the flattened vowels of someone from the northern plains. I looked at Nora. She nodded. 3 occupants. 1 medical. Requesting identification. A pause. My name is Gene Kimura Walsh. My father was Hideo Kimura. He built the communications array you're using. I've been broadcasting on this frequency for 19 days. You're the first response. Dale had said Kimura moved to Japan. His daughter, Jun, had apparently come back, or never left. Where are you? I asked. 12 miles northwest, a farmstead off Route 11. I have supplies and transportation, but I can't hold this position much longer. The infected are moving in organized groups now. They hit the property east of me 2 days ago, 30 or more. Coordinated approach, multiple entry points. I'm alone. Nora leaned toward the microphone. Gene, this is Nora Castillo. I'm a paramedic. Are you injured? Negative. But I'm not going to be uninjured much longer if I stay here. Can you receive me? I thought about Dale's condition, about the supplies, about the space. The complex had room for 8. We were 3. The math was simple. Affirmative. Come to Garretson Relay. Approach from the North Road. We'll have the equipment barn open. Copy. I'll move at first light. Relay out. The radio went silent. Nora sat back and exhaled slowly. The first unguarded moment of fatigue I'd seen from her since the farmhouse. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands and said, 4 is better than 3. If she is who she says she is. She knew the call sign. She knew the frequency. She knew about the array. Anyone could have found that information. Dale's notebook isn't the only record, if the other members of this group kept notes. Then someone found them and is using them to locate a shelter during the apocalypse. Nora dropped her hands and looked at me. Elliot, that's exactly what a survivor would do. That's what we did. She was right. The suspicion I was feeling wasn't rational. It was territorial, primal. The bunker psychology Dale had warned about without using those words. The moment you find safety, you start seeing every other survivor as a threat to it. I recognized the impulse and hated it, but I couldn't fully dismiss it either. The next morning, I told Dale about the contact. He was sitting up in bed, color slightly better, heartbeat audible on the stethoscope Nora left hanging on the bedpost for self-monitoring. When I said the name Kimura, something moved across his face, not surprise, but a complex architecture of memory and regret. Hideo had a daughter, he said. Jean, born here, raised in Sioux Falls. She went to Stanford. Hideo moved to Sapporo after his wife died, but Jean stayed stateside. He paused, recalculating. She'd be mid-40s now. Hideo told her about the complex, against protocol, but he was dying. Cancer, like Martin. He wanted someone in his family to know. You trusted him with that decision? I trusted him with my life for 30 years. Yes, I trusted his judgment about his own daughter. Jean arrived at midday. She drove a mud-caked Subaru wagon loaded with radio equipment, batteries, canned food, and a compound bow she handled with the ease of a lifelong archer. She was small, precise, and had the same evaluative gaze as Nora. Though where Nora's was medical, Jean's was mechanical. She looked at things and saw systems, how they worked, how they failed, how they could be improved. When she saw Dale, she stopped in the corridor and stared at him for a long time. "You're Mercer," she said. "My father talked about you constantly. He said you were the most stubborn man he'd ever met." "Hideo was right about most things," Dale said. "He said if the world ended, you'd be the last one standing." Dale coughed, a wet, ugly sound that contradicted the image. "Sitting, maybe. Standing's getting harder." Jean moved into the complex like she'd been there before, and maybe she had. Hideo might have brought her at some point, violating protocol one more time in the name of legacy. She familiarized herself with the communications room in under an hour and immediately began expanding the short-wave array's range using equipment she'd brought. By evening, she was cycling through 40 additional frequencies, listening for any signal in the continental void. She found two. One was the same automated emergency broadcast that had been looping since week 1. Useless, institutional, a ghost. The other was a voice transmission, brief and garbled, from somewhere south. The only words she could parse were "so," "highway," "overrun," "moving north." Moving north. Toward us. The next 4 days were the most productive and most frightening of my life. John and I reinforced the equipment barn's ground-level entrance with steel plate from the silos, creating a blast door effect that could withstand significant force. Nora organized the medical room into a functional trauma center and ran drills with me. Wound packing, tourniquet application, emergency airway management, that she delivered with the detached efficiency of someone who had taught these skills while people were dying around her. Dale directed from a chair in the corridor, his body failing but his mind relentless. He drew diagrams of the ventilation system, explained the generator's maintenance cycle, outlined protocols for water rationing, waste management, and communications schedules. He was downloading himself into us, transferring 40 years of preparation into 3 people he'd known for less than 2 weeks. And the urgency in his voice told me he knew the timeline better than Nora's stethoscope could. On the 3rd evening, Jean picked up a clear transmission, not automated, live. "This is Thomas Briggs, Jr. I'm on I-90 eastbound, mile marker 112. I have 11 people in 4 vehicles. We've been driving for 6 days from Billings. We're out of fuel and the road ahead is blocked. There are hundreds of them, moving east in a column. If anyone can hear this, we need a route or a destination. Please respond. Briggs." Dale had mentioned a Briggs. Died in 2015, car accident. This was his son. Jean looked at Dale. Dale closed his eyes. "His father was one of the 12, Dale said. Tommy. He was 8 the last time I saw him. He must be 30-something now." Jean's fingers hovered over the transmit button. "Do I respond?" 11 people. We had food for 8, conservatively rationed for maybe 3 months. Add 11 and the math collapsed to weeks. But 11 people also meant labor, defense, skills we didn't have. And they were on E90, which meant they were maybe 90 miles west. Close enough to reach if they had fuel. Far enough to die if they didn't. "They said hundreds," Nora said from the doorway, "moving east in a column." The word column did something to all of us. It confirmed what we'd been avoiding, what Nora's second phase designation only hinted at. The infected weren't scattering. They were migrating, organized, directional. And the direction was toward the most densely built infrastructure in the region, Sioux Falls, 30 miles south. The city would be a magnet, and when whatever drew them there was consumed, they'd spread outward, toward Garretson, toward us. "Respond," Dale said. "Give them the coordinates. Tell them to come on fumes if they have to." Jean transmitted. The response was immediate. Thomas Briggs, Jr., voice breaking with relief, confirming receipt, estimating arrival within 24 hours if they could siphon enough fuel from abandoned vehicles. Jean gave him approach instructions, landmarks, the frequency for ongoing communication. After the transmission, we sat in the corridor and confronted what we'd just done. Dale was the one who named it. "We've just chosen who we are," he said. "Every shelter faces this moment. You can seal the door and survive, or you can open it and risk everything on the belief that survival means more than breathing." Hideo and I argued about this for 20 years. He wanted strict protocols, maximum occupancy, vetting procedures. I wanted... He stopped, breathed. I wanted to believe that the point of building this place was so it could be used by anyone who found their way here. "And if the food runs out?" Nora asked, not challenging, measuring. "Then we find more. Or we don't. But we don't die having turned away 11 people because the spreadsheet said no." The words hung in the filtered air of the complex, and I realized that Dale Mercer, this man I'd found eating peanut butter in my barn 10 days ago, had just articulated the only philosophy that still mattered. Not survival as arithmetic, but survival as choice, as identity, as the decision about what kind of human you remain when humanity is dissolving. I thought about the man in the ditch on the Iowa road, the one we'd driven past, the one whose face I was already forgetting, because forgetting was easier than carrying. Dale had said that's the cost, and now he was saying this is the correction. Not atonement, nothing so clean, but a refusal to let the previous choice define every future one. "I'll start rationing calculations," Nora said, and went to the storage room. Jean returned to the radio. Dale sat in his chair, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with the mechanical irregularity that Nora heard in every beat. And I went upstairs, into the cold South Dakota air, and looked south toward a sky that glowed faintly orange where Sioux Falls was burning. Thomas Briggs, Jr. arrived not in 24 hours, but in 38, and not with 11 people, but with 7. 4 had been lost on I-90 when the column of infected they'd reported shifted direction and cut through their convoy like a blade through thread. The 4 vehicles were now 2, a minivan and a pickup with a camper shell. And the 7 survivors who climbed out in the equipment barn lot looked like people who had been chewed up by the world and only partially spit back out. Thomas was 32, broad-shouldered, with his dead father's name and a mechanic's hands. He introduced the others with the abbreviated efficiency of someone who'd been making introductions at gunpoint. His wife, Cassidy, a former school teacher who carried a tire iron and hadn't spoken in 2 days. Marcus and Elena, siblings in their 20s from a ranch outside Billings who'd lost their parents in the first week. An older man named Petrov, no first name offered, who'd been a long-haul trucker and knew the interstate system like a nervous system. And 2 teenage boys, 15 and 16, brothers named Caleb and Owen, who'd been found hiding in a truck stop bathroom outside Rapid City. 7 people. With our 4, that made 11. The complex was designed for 12. Nora triaged immediately, checking for bites, scratches, signs of infection, signs of dehydration, signs of shock. Everyone passed the physical check. Cassidy failed the psychological one, and Nora pulled me aside. "She's in acute dissociative state," she said. "The silence isn't stubbornness. She's not processing. She saw something on the road that her mind won't integrate. She needs time, safety, and very careful handling. Don't push her to talk. Don't ask what happened." "What did happen?" Nora shook her head. "Thomas told me while I was checking Caleb's ankle. Cassidy was driving the third vehicle, the one that got cut off. She drove through them. Through, not around. She's covered in evidence she can't wash off even though she's physically clean." I looked at Cassidy, sitting on a cot in the living quarters, hands folded in her lap, eyes focused on a spot on the opposite wall. The tire iron was on the floor beside her, within reach. Thomas sat next to her, not touching her, just present. The distance between them was the width of a hand and the depth of whatever she'd driven through. Dale met Thomas in the corridor that evening. The moment was weighted with inheritance, the son of a dead man meeting the last survivor of his father's dream. Thomas shook Dale's hand and held it and said, "My dad talked about you, all of you. He said this place was proof that people could plan for the worst without becoming the worst." "Your father was an optimist," Dale said. "It made him a good engineer and a terrible poker player." Thomas laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd heard since the world ended. It echoed in the concrete corridor like something endangered. Over the next 3 days, we integrated. Petrov knew diesel generators and water systems, and he took over maintenance of the complex's infrastructure with a silent competence that freed John to focus entirely on communications. Marcus and Elena were ranchers. They understood livestock, crop cycles, soil management, and immediately began planning a surface garden for spring using the vacuum-sealed seeds from storage. Thomas worked with me on perimeter defense, applying a mechanic's understanding of stress points and material limits that improved our barrier design significantly. Caleb and Owen were the ones who surprised me. Teenagers, traumatized, pulled from a bathroom where they'd hidden for 3 days after their parents didn't come back from a supply run. I expected them to be fragile. They weren't. They were angry, focused, and desperate to be useful. Owen had been in junior ROTC and understood basic tactical communication. Caleb had been building computers since he was 11 and, within hours of arrival, had the complex's old monitoring system, a network of cameras Dale's group had installed in the original construction but never fully activated, running on the battery bank. The cameras showed us the surface. 4 angles, north, south, east, west. And what they showed, on the evening of the 3rd day after Thomas's arrival, was movement. Not a handful of infected testing a fence line. Not a dozen standing motionless in a tree line. A mass, coming from the south, spread across the fields like a dark tide, hundreds of figures moving with a slow, unified purpose that Nora had described, and none of us had truly believed until we saw it on a grainy screen in an underground room. "That's not a group," Jones said, standing behind Caleb at the monitor. "That's a migration." The mass reached the property line by nightfall. On the cameras, we watched them arrive, not charging, not frantic, but steady, filling the fields the way water fills a basin. They surrounded the ranch house first, pressing against its walls, entering through windows and doors, moving through the rooms as if searching. When they found nothing, they moved to the outbuildings, the garage, the silos, the equipment barn, whose reinforced entrance sat directly above the staircase to our shelter. "They can't know we're down here," Thomas said. We were all in the corridor, 11 people in a concrete tube, watching a screen that showed the world above us being consumed. They don't need to know, Nora said. They just need to stand on top of us long enough to prevent us from leaving. Dale was in his chair at the end of the corridor, oxygen concentrator humming beside him. Nora had put him on supplemental oxygen that morning after his saturation dropped below 90. He looked like a man watching something he'd built being tested against the exact scenario he'd designed it for, uncertain whether the design would hold. "The complex has a secondary exit," he said. His voice was thin but clear. Hideo insisted on it. North side, 200 yards from the barn, exits through a culvert under Route 11. It was designed for exactly this scenario. Primary entrance compromised, lateral evacuation required. "You didn't mention this before," I said. "I didn't need to before." Jean already had the notebook open, finding the page. Section 14. Tunnel diameter 30 inches. Reinforced PVC. Total length 212 feet. Exit concealed by drainage grate on the north shoulder of Route 11. 30 inches. That was tight. For Petrov, who was broad-chested, it might be impossible. For Dale, on supplemental oxygen with an irregular heart. "I'm not going through the tunnel," Dale said, as if reading my thought. "I'll stay here, monitor the radio, keep the systems running, and guide you out by comms." "That's not an option," I said. "It's the only option that doesn't get all of us killed." He leaned forward, and I saw in his face the same resignation I'd seen in the barn the day we met. A man who had expected this moment. "I'm a liability on the surface. My knee, my heart, my age. Through a 30-inch tunnel, I become a blockage, literally and figuratively. I stay, I keep the air scrubber running, and if the infected move on, which they will, they always move on, I resurface and resume the broadcast. And if they don't move on, then I have enough food and water for 60 days, alone. That's 2 months of broadcasting, 2 months of potential contacts, 2 months of being useful." Nora started to speak, but Dale raised his hand. "You know I'm right. You've been doing the triage math since we met. I saw it in your face the first day, when you told Elliot about my heart. You were already calculating when I'd stop being an asset and start being a patient. I'm telling you, that moment is now. I become a patient the moment I enter that tunnel. Down here, I remain operational." The room was silent, except for the hum of the air scrubber and the soft static of the radio. 11 people, breathing the same filtered air, weighing the same impossible equation. Dale Mercer was asking us to leave him, not because he wanted to die, but because he understood the architecture of survival better than any of us. He'd built the shelter. He knew its tolerances. He knew his own. I sat down on the floor next to his chair. "The notebook," I said. "The coordinates for other sites. Are there more complexes like this one?" 2. One in western Nebraska, one in northern Minnesota. I don't know their status. The Nebraska site was maintained by Lewis before his stroke. Minnesota was Hideo's project before he left. The coordinates are in the notebook. If the tunnel takes you north, follow Route 11 to the state highway, then go east, away from Sioux Falls, away from the migration. Come with us. I am coming with you." He tapped the notebook in my hands. "Every page, every diagram, every frequency. That's more of me than this body has left to give." Nora crouched beside him and checked his pulse one final time. Her face, usually clinically composed, had softened into something unguarded. "The metoprolol is in the cabinet, second shelf. Take it every 12 hours. If your chest tightens, chew an aspirin and lie flat. If you feel faint, I'll manage, Doc. He covered her hand with his. Go save some lives. It's what you're good at. We prepared. Caleb and Owen went first through the tunnel, their smaller frames navigating the 30-inch diameter with relative ease. Marcus and Elena followed. Then Thomas guiding Cassidy, who moved through the darkness with the mechanical compliance of someone operating on someone else's will. Nora went next, then John carrying the essential radio equipment. Petrov, who, as predicted, had to exhale fully and press himself flat to fit, went second to last, propelled by stubbornness and the memory of every mile of highway he'd ever driven alone. I went last. At the tunnel entrance, I turned back. Dale was in his chair, oxygen line in his nose, the radio headset around his neck, the bank of monitors glowing behind him. He looked exactly like what he was, a man at his post. Elliot, he said. Yeah. Your mother loved this place, and she loved you. She didn't tell you about the shelter because she wanted you to have a life that didn't include preparing for the end of the world. He paused. She was right to want that, even if it didn't work out. I entered the tunnel. The culvert exit opened onto the north shoulder of Route 11 under a sky crowded with stars. The air was cold and clean and felt like a different substance entirely from what we'd been breathing underground. 11 of us, 10 now, I kept correcting the count, stood on the gravel shoulder and looked south, where the glow of the complex's surface cameras was invisible, but the mass of infected was not. They moved across the fields like a weather system, slow and vast. And the sound they made, that collective broken moan, rose into the night, like something geological. We had the two vehicles Thomas's group had arrived in, parked behind the garage. To reach them would mean crossing back through the property, through the infected. Not an option. We were on foot, 10 people on a highway in the dark, carrying what we could fit through a 30-inch tunnel. Jean had the radio, a handheld unit connected to a battery pack. She keyed it once, and Dale's voice came back immediately. Thin, crackling, but present. North on Route 11 for 4 miles. There's a farm co-op with a fuel depot. Thomas, you'll know how to hotwire the vehicles there. Stay off the main roads after that. The notebook has the route to the Nebraska site. Copy, I said. Vanguard 6, stay alive. We walked. 10 people in a loose column, spaced 10 feet apart, moving by starlight on a 2-lane road through the Great Plains. The sound of our footsteps was the loudest thing in the world. Caleb and Owen walked point, young eyes, fast reflexes, and Petrov brought up the rear, his trucker's spatial awareness adapted to watching for threats instead of merging lanes. Nora walked beside me. After a mile, she said, "He's going to die down there." Maybe, not maybe. The arrhythmia will progress. Without monitoring, without intervention, he'll have an event. Weeks, maybe less. He knows. He knew at the farmhouse. He knew before we found him. She was quiet for a few steps. He came back for the notebook, Elliot. When we evacuated, he sent you to get the notebook. Not the food, not the weapons. The notebook. Because the notebook was how he survived past his own body. I held the notebook in my jacket, against my chest, and felt its weight like a heartbeat. Dale Mercer's 40 years of preparation, of solitary dedication, of a life organized around a catastrophe he hoped would never come, compressed into pages of small, controlled handwriting. Maps, coordinates, frequencies, protocols, engineering diagrams, and the occasional personal entry that revealed the man behind the infrastructure. He'd written, on one of the early pages, a single sentence that I'd read 3 times and never mentioned to anyone. If this is ever needed, I hope someone braver than me is reading it. We reached the co-op at dawn. Thomas found a truck with a full tank. The owners had probably fled in something faster, and hot-wired it in under 4 minutes. We loaded everyone in, and he drove east, away from the migration, away from Garretson, away from a man sitting alone in an underground room, broadcasting into the void, waiting for someone to answer. I'm recording this at the Nebraska site. We arrived 11 days ago. The complex here is smaller than Garretson, and it had been partially looted. Lewis's family, we think, taking what they could before they moved on. But the structure is intact. The water system works. The radio works. We've made contact with 3 other groups. One near Omaha, 14 people in a warehouse. One in Kansas, a family of 6 on a cattle ranch that's become a fortress. And one signal we can't fully decode, repeating on a frequency Dale never listed, using a call sign none of us recognize. Dale's broadcast from Garretson continued for 23 days after we left. Gene monitored it every night, confirming his signal, exchanging brief transmissions. He reported the infected migration passing through the property and continuing east towards Sioux Falls. He reported the surface structures destroyed, but the complex undamaged. He reported that he was managing his medication, that the air scrubber was functioning, that the solitude was tolerable. On day 24, the broadcast stopped. John tried for a week. Nothing. I carry the notebook in my jacket. I've memorized the critical pages, the coordinates, the frequencies, the engineering specifications. But I keep the physical object because it's the closest thing I have to proof that a man I barely knew gave me everything he'd spent his life building. Not because I'd earned it, not because I deserved it, because I was there, and the door was open, and he believed that was enough. My mother would have understood. She always left doors open too.